So today I'm going to speak with Rachel, Maya and William of the film In My Blood It Runs. I'm very happy to welcome them all three. We are going to talk to them one by one and ask them various questions. So we will start with Maya Newell, the director of In My Blood It Runs. Hi Maya, it's a pleasure to have you here from Australia actually. How are you?
Hi, thanks so much for having our film in the film festival. We're really honoured to be sharing this story, and at least we get to travel the world in this strange COVID time virtually. I also just wanted to start by acknowledging the land that I am on right now and I had the privilege to grow up on, which is Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation here in Sydney in Australia. But also wanted to acknowledge the Aranda people in Bantua and Garo people in Borroloola, where we've had the privilege to make this film and walk alongside families and learn over the last 3 or 4 years, and just welcome anyone who is from First Nations backgrounds who's joining us on the call today and honour their ancestors, past and present and emerging.
You started by honouring the land you're living on. When I was in Australia a few years back, I got to know this wonderful tradition. You also made a film about the First Nation in Australia, which is a very close portrait of a very lively young boy who's just taking everyone's heart by storm with his spirit. You just also mentioned you live in Sydney. The people you portrayed live somewhere else. How did it come that you portrayed this boy in particular?
Yeah, it's a lovely question, and actually it's really nice. Usually we speak all together, but you've got William, who you'll be hearing from soon on the call, who is calling in from Mbantua, from Alice Springs, where the film was made. I was living there for the last couple of years while we were making the film, and now I'm not there. But I think the film came about and the story emerged. It sits on the bed of about a decade of relationships. For me, working with Aranda families in Alice Springs and in Mbantua, but also a number of different people on our crew who have long familial relationships and have worked alongside families. So when I was 21 or so, I was invited by a Kilira Healing Centre, which is a local Aboriginal-led organisation in Alice Springs, to make films alongside them while they were educating their children in language and culture and identity. It's actually a place where families can strengthen traditional healing knowledge, which you'll learn about when you watch the film or if you'd watched the film, and also where kids and families can have access out onto country with various programs for men and for women and children. And we'd make films which were largely just educational tools, so just for families, not for the outside world, short films. And over those years, through the leadership of all of the elders at that place, who are also now the advisors on this film, Margaret Kamara Turner, Felicity Hayes, Amelia Turner, Mrs. Abbott Prula, I learnt a lot. And I think that really was the grounding for the way that we could make this film. Significantly, it felt like we were telling the same story over and over again in these short films where you'd have children who spoke 1, 2, 3 Indigenous languages, who were confident in their first culture, who knew where their country was, knew how to, hunt a goanna, but then they'd come into the mainstream education system and were told that they felt like failures at school because they were only measured by Western values and only, taught in English, which is, it's just a massive issue in Australia where you've got the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights that says that children should have education through their own language and through their own culture, yet we just don't afford that to the first peoples of this country. But then I worked with Dwan's grandmother in the film, Carol, and Megan for a number of years, and then met Dwan out on a camp one day, and he just bounded up and was very energetic and talkative, and really just wanted the camera on him all the time. And we had a really lovely bond, and he really wanted a film made about him, which was really lovely. And I think that he has this beautiful poeticism in the way that he describes the world around him, is on that cusp of adulthood and childhood, where he's able and just becoming cognizant of the complexities of the world around him. And I thought, he would be an amazing conduit for sharing a story of what it's like to grow up as a First Nations person in this country, in this racist country of Australia. So we sat with his families. Rachel, who you're about to hear from, came on as a producer, and William as an advisor at that early stage, and helped ask those hard questions of, what sort of film should this be? Are we the right people to make it? And I think, sitting on a long history of misappropriation of First Nation stories throughout history, these are really important questions, well, for any film team to ask, but in particular when we, I'm Japanese Australian, I'm not from this country, but even Rachel, who is First Nations from Alaska, is not from Aranda country, and our other producer, Larissa Berent, she's Aboriginal but not from that country. And so there began a really beautiful collaboration over many years that really aimed at centering the family and their agency in the story that we told. It's a long story. I'm sure you'll hear from other people, but it's been a hard but also beautiful process.
I will take with Rachel later a bit more about the way you set up the production, because I think that's really interesting and something we can all learn from. But you also set up a quite lovely impact campaign within Australia, and I want to raise awareness for certain issues, and I wanted to ask you more about that impact campaign in particular, because for us at the festival, documentaries are a tool to create impact. So my first question is, how did you find the issue of your impact campaign? What was it? And then the second part is, how did the impact campaign work in Australia?
It's a great question. It's so nice to be at a human rights festival where we can just talk unashamedly, directly about the motivation for making the film. I think that, for all of us on the team, impact is absolutely the driving force, and we felt that we could make a beautiful piece of art that is, moves people's hearts and minds, but essentially drives them to do something and be a part of the solution. We were very lucky because we had the support of Good Pitch and BritDoc to make, and a lot of philanthropists, and also the amazing work of Children's Ground, one of our partner organisations, of which William, who you're about to hear from, is the chair. And that sort of guidance early on, which means that we were able to raise money for a social impact campaign before we even started making the film, which is really rare in documentary. But it also means that we could sit down early on with the families and say, this is, when we finish making this film, we'll walk alongside you and try and use it to challenge some of the issues faced by Dwan and your family. So as we were beginning to get to the end of the actual production, of which we had workshops the whole way along through editing and post-production about the story, we transferred those production workshops with families into what do you want to see changed, and the impact side, the distribution side. And the key goals that came out for families, firstly, was racism. How do we stop racism in Australia? And obviously that's a massive goal, and something we're struggling with all around the world, but also beginning to see it in a new way. And I think that film does that. just by releasing the film and going out and, you know, offering the film for people to host their own screenings, take the issues into their own communities. So we've been doing a massive amount of community-led impact screenings and with different sectors throughout juvenile justice and education. The other big areas around juvenile justice, how do we build restorative approaches to juvenile justice? And that in particular, we've so far had the time to focus in on this issue of incarceration age, which is 10 years old in Australia. We lock up a 10-year-old, which is 4 years younger than the International Human Rights Standard, but it's also the age of Dwan in the film. So kind of accidentally, the film's become a very big tool in that area. And the other large area is in education reform. How do we build a First Nations-led education system in this country and allow families the control to, control over their children's education, which is something that has not happened since colonisation. In fact, education has been used as a tool to control families and assimilate them into white culture, as seen in the film. We've been working, offering the film out for free across Australia for schools, developing education resources that have really gone in really well, and also kind of working on behind the scenes with different organisations around how to build, support teachers to be able to do make their classrooms culturally appropriate for First Nations children. So there's heaps of work happening on the background, but if people are interested and want to see, importantly, what Dwan and his family wanted to see changed, you can go to our website, which is inmyblooditruns.com/takeaction, and you can sign petitions, you can donate for a school an Arundel-led school to be built on Dwan's homeland, and learn more about the key issues in the film. And a really nice fact for audiences is that Dwan had the opportunity to go and speak at the United Nations in September last year, where he became the youngest person ever to address the Human Rights Council. And in his words, he said, "I want adults to stop cruelling children in jail. I want my school to be run by Aboriginal people. I want my future to be out on land with strong language and culture." And those were his three messages, because he felt the Australian government was not listening. And it was incredibly powerful.
It sounds incredibly powerful, and it sounds like a wonderful impact campaign. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I just hope everyone can share it with their friends and so forth, and get Dwan's story out there.
Hi Rachel, it's a pleasure to have you here from Alaska. I think we have 3 completely different time zones here. It must be in the middle of the night, I guess.
Actually, it's evening time here. I'm perfect opening to start off with an acknowledgement of the country that I'm calling in from. I'm stuck in Australia due to the COVID crisis, and very happy to be joining you today. Thank you for having us. By way of starting, I'd love to acknowledge the welcome that I've had from the Wurundjeri Nation here in what is also known as Melbourne, and the knowledge and wisdom I've been incredibly fortunate to walk alongside and learn from with the Arundel people and the Garawa people, where the story that Dwan shares comes from. And then my own people, as you say, I am from Alaska. I'm supposed to be in Alaska right now, but my own ancestors and what I've been fortunate to be raised in, and then welcome everybody else who's joined us, especially other First Nations people and your audience who've come to listen to us tonight. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Before the interview officially started, we already started to talk a bit about documentary and production theory behind it. And I did hear a presentation of Maya in London a few months ago, before the whole pandemic, and she explained there very lively how you found an inclusive way of producing documentaries, where the protagonists are taking a very intensive part and role in what you show and what you don't show. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about how the whole production process works.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we really enjoyed talking about this as we spent a lot of time working on this model. And as a First Nations person coming from a community where there is such a strong history and continued misappropriation of our stories and a continued lack of agency over telling our own stories to the rest of the world, at the very beginning of this project, it was always sort of our North Star to make sure that we were only going to do this film if we could make sure that we were doing it right by Dwan and his family and the community that he comes from. And that for us started off of two key understandings. One was we had to interrogate our own bias and the bias of the industry that we're working in and the impact of that bias on the communities, on the other communities who don't have agency and power in those industries. And then we had to adjust our working model and unlearn and relearn other ways of doing things, which dealt with the biases that we were coming in that the industry has. And then two, we had to create real partnerships of agency and power for those communities. And you'll hear from William Tilmouth, who's one of the core influencers in this particular project and in a lot of this working model. The way that we've done this film sits in kind of a long line of communities and people of color and other communities pushing for a new way of doing documentaries, so that the stories that are being told about our communities are being told by our communities instead of about us, and instead of perpetuating the Western gaze and the kind of colonialism that we all know so well is terrible impact on our communities. So that for us meant that before we even started filming, before we even accepted funds, before we even started looking for funds, we sat on the ground with the families and the communities and we said, there's an opportunity here. Are you interested? What is it? What is a story you would like to tell? What would that look like? And how does that look for you? Are we the right people to tell that story? And we did that in a number of ways, because if you need to increase your competency of communities you're working with. So we did that through sitting directly with families, and we also did that through actively seeking partnerships with organizations and community-led organizations on the ground who we knew already came from the people that we were working with and could have the conversation without us in the room and say, these are the filmmakers, these are who they are, do you want to try this? Do you want to go down this path? And once we started that, then we sat and said, if we're going to do this, this is what our structure needs to look like, so that we ensure that we're beholden to, we are accountable to a structure in the film industry that was doing everything we could, and we learned a lot on the way, and we learned a lot from other projects that came with us. And primarily, we learned a lot from, our advisors and the elders in the community themselves, who every aspect of our consultation model and every aspect of our working model is inspired by the communities themselves. As William always said, Aboriginal people do consultation in their everyday living. And it destroys the myth that is often perpetuated that Aboriginal people can't plan things. This was a very well planned out process in film that we were just privileged to be invited in alongside. And then we embarked on that path as a film team of saying, what is it that we need to know? What is it we need to become aware of? How do we need to adjust what we're doing? And at every step of the way, we were self-reflexive about that. So every time we hit something in the filming process or the story process, or, and when you're filming with children, right, duty of care and how you construct that and how we place the story in a context, every single point we would come back to the principles and we would come back to the conversation with the community. And we, flipped the normal way of doing documentaries and said, if we want to ensure that this is not a story being told about the community, but we are telling it with the community in a true collaboration, they actually have to be behind the scenes. They have to see the rushes. We have to have the story conversations with them before we get to the editing room, before the final cut. So we did all those workshops, and we made all of that space very early on. And then we did things like ensuring that we had advisors who would fill gaps that we had. So, William brings an incredible amount of knowledge and lived experience and professional experience in all of the spaces that Dwan faces. And then M.K. Turner, Felicity Hayes, Amelia, these are like huge names in this area of the world who bring all this knowledge and in-depth and experience and, wisdom that gave the context and grounding for our film, but also gave us as filmmakers a chance to say, how do we ground the story in this beautiful landscape that this child is existing in, so that that comes across on the screen, knowing that we haven't grown up there, we're not from that community, and there's a whole lot of knowledge and information that no matter how hard we work, we're never going to know. You actually have to give control and agency over to the community to drive how the story takes shape, where the camera sits, how the music is played in, you know, all of those aspects were collaboratively done. And it was a very beautiful sort of marriage in that way, because we were incredibly lucky in our film team that we had no resistance to this. And it's a hard thing to give over that kind of power. You know, traditional documentaries are not made like that. The documentary is controlled by the director and the producer, and they make all of the choices. And you never say to your, you know, you think of them as subjects, and you think of your protagonist as, you know, how did you get access? How did you negotiate that? What did you say? And in our case, it wasn't a negotiation. It was always an upfront, as we understand the history we sit in, we understand the context of racism and of disempowerment, and we're going to give you that power to tell us how it is. And then you tell us what you want to be there, what you don't want to be there. And then through that process, we built that trust, so that there was a beautiful story and a nuanced and authentic story that came out in the end, which is always the fear in the documentary industry, that if you give that sort of power over to your subjects, over to your characters on screen, they're not going to let you see the real story. Where in our case, because of what we built, what we found was the exact opposite. And in my work previous to this film, and you know, William's work as well in other areas, like you see those in other projects, you know, it's shown again and again that if you construct if you adjust for the bias in the industry, the bias in the world that we live in, your results are much more powerful. And so we were just really, really lucky on this project to have those aspects as guiding forces. And really the model comes from the work of lots of people, but primarily it comes from the ground of communities who've done this before anybody arrived on their shores. This is how they operate. This is how the community structure works.
I think we can all learn quite a lot from that approach, not just with filming with First Nations, but with doing documentaries with any people we portrayed. Because I really like the approach that it's very inclusive and very empowering. How did you learn about the project that Maya planned with In My Blood It Runs?
I think it's more about the evolution of the film in how it developed. Maya was involved with the people for quite some time prior to the making of the film. And the evolution of that just grew from the Duane firstly wanting to make a movie, to make a film. Maya was looking to how to make a film, and the involvement of the families and the people was just quite extraordinary in relation to wanting to do it. The participation in the film was invited to be part of it as an advisor. For two reasons, I believe, is I was at the time, and still am, the chairman of an organisation called Children's Ground, which has a close association with another organisation, Aquila, which Maya had worked between the two organisations for some time, doing odds and bits and pieces. And I was invited by, the second reason is also that the film, a lot of it has my relatives in there, family members, and that trust of me was there to say the right thing, to do the right thing, and also that trust had to be built up with the film directors, Maya, Rachel, all the people involved. and it took some time to build up that trust and to be able to have people confide in you and talk to you about the contents and how they would like it made and what they would like to include in it and how they would go about it. And so it was not just a 1 minute thought and 5 minute conclusion. It was taken some time. It evolved over quite some years. I think around about 10 years all up. It's building up that rapport, that trust, that understanding, the belief that the right thing will be done and how it will be done. And as Maya says, Duane always wanted to have a film about himself. As a 10-year-old kid, he had a lot to say and he had a lot to contribute. And and it's so evident now that his wisdom for such a young person is so apparent in the film. And so it took some time. It wasn't off the cuff or a one-off. It was worked on thoroughly, and consultation was always the key word in regards to the process.
You also developed the impact campaign in Australia together. How is your reflection on the campaign? Do you think you reach people, and you also developed the messages of the impact campaign together? How do you think the film contributes to change the minds of people?
Well, clearly, the history of colonisation in Australia actually denied, in many cases, your right to speak your own language, your ability to educate your children in the way that you've grown up for centuries in relation to Aboriginal knowledge systems and the way that things were done. The whole idea of assimilation was to fragment the foundations of your identity, your language, your culture, your country, and take away any way that your families and the way that you can build your life as an Aboriginal person. It was all about assimilation in the Western domination of English as your first language. And that sort of came to pass in regards to the film showed that very clearly, that the Aboriginal way of doing things, the First Nations way of doing things in Australia is still alive. It's still there, it's present, but it's in danger of being becoming extinct in the way that we do things. I mean, there's over 250 odd tribal groups in Australia, and out of that 250 groups, there's only 13 languages that are currently being spoken and taught in schools or has fluency to. So you can see that the way the First Nations people's lives have diminished by taking away their land, by actually stealing the land, if that's the way of putting it, denying them identity and denying them language and family, was all part of the assimilation process of westernising an ancient people.
Thank you so much. That was a very inspiring last statement, and I think also it will give our audience something on the way to think about and also to discuss. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.